Hi friends, Angelica Vanetta, co-chair of Inclusive ICR. We are a coalition of over 220 employers in Eastern Iowa, all working together to grow the diversity and inclusion of our workforce, to create a space where employees feel a sense of belonging, included, and valued. Inclusive ICR is a proud sponsor of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion track of the Iowa Ideas Conference. As you participate today, be sure to connect with other Inclusive ICR champions, as we'd love to share information with you about our upcoming coalition meetings, projects, and how our work is impacting positive social change in our region. Be sure to visit our website at inclusiveiowa.org for information on upcoming events and to sign up for our e-newsletter. Thank you and have a great conference.
Welcome everyone to the Potential in Good Conflict panel discussion this morning. I'm Kate Moreland, and I just want to thank you for attending this important topic. We have some great panelists today, but before I introduce them, I do want to thank our sponsors. So ITC Midwest is the sponsor of this session, and this is part of the DEI track, which is sponsored by Inclusive ICR. So thank you to those sponsors. I want to remind all of you that this is being recorded and closed captioning access is available should you need it. And you can submit questions through the Q&A function. We'll try to get to those toward the end, but please, as you have a question, feel free to throw that in the chat. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our panelists. They're going to have a few minutes to introduce themselves, but we have attorney Alfredo Parrish out of Des Moines. We have consultant and speaker Angie Chaplin, political author and speaker Diane Bystrom, and executive director of Cedar Rapids Civil Rights Commission, Stephanie Munsterman. So welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for being with us today to be part of this panel and really a timely discussion. I'm going to go ahead and give each of you a chance to introduce yourselves formally and your backgrounds so we have an idea of all the wonderful things you're doing out in the state of Iowa and in the community. So we'll start with attorney Alfredo. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm an attorney here in Des Moines, Iowa. I practice with 17 other lawyers in a firm that I founded in 1975. I started work at Legal Aid, finished the University of Iowa. To give you some idea of, we have a statewide practice. We do about a third immigration law, a third criminal defense, and then private practice. To give you an idea of how I work, yesterday morning I got at 7 o'clock. I was in Black Hawk County at the jail taking depositions. I drove to Cedar Rapids, met with a client in Cedar Rapids, came back to Des Moines, and took a bike ride. So that's kind of a typical day with my work. I work with some brilliant young lawyers and partners of mine who've been with me for probably 20, 25 years.
Welcome. Thank you so much. All right, Angie, can you go ahead and give us a little background?
Absolutely. Good morning. I'm Angie Chaplin, and I am both a small business owner and a social entrepreneur. So I have a perspective that crosses industry as well as the nonprofit sector. I work primarily in strengthening leadership capacity within behavioral health and human services as the founder of Brave Leadership, which is a 501c3 organization serving statewide and responding to the needs within health and human services. My 30 years of work encompasses strategic and organizational development, human resources, leadership development, and working with individuals as a coach, as well as speaking and consulting in the government sector. I'm also a leader in long-term recovery from mental health conditions and alcohol use disorder, which gives me both an interpersonal as well as professional perspective when it comes to managing good conflict.
Thank you, Angie. Now we'll hear from Diane.
Thanks, Kate, and thank you all for attending today. I'm Diane Bystrom. I'm the Director Emerita of the Carrie Chapman Cat Center for Women in Politics at Iowa State University. I directed the Cat Center for 22 years and also founded and directed our interdisciplinary leadership studies program for 10 years. I'm now retired and living in Nebraska, south of Omaha, but I'm staying active. I'm the Director of Communication for the League of Women Voters of Nebraska. I also am a speaker for Humanities Nebraska, and I am also continuing my research primarily on women in politics. I have co-authored 2 books on gender and politics, including Gender and Politics, Changing the Face of Civic Life, which we did then look at civic life. And so that's apropos for today, which was published this summer. And I'm also edited 8 books, 5 of which were on the elections. So my, I guess, topic on this panel is politics and leadership and having conversations about it.
Great. Thank you, Diane. And Stephanie.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having us today, and thank you to all of you who chose to participate in this session. So my name is Stephanie Munsterman, she, her. I serve as the Executive Director of the Cedar Rapids Civil Rights Commission. In this role, I lead our efforts in Cedar Rapids to protect individuals from discrimination while fostering equitable treatment within our community. Additionally, I'm an adjunct professor at a local university where I teach systems thinking, growth mindset, as well as dispute resolution. So I'm part of my role at the civil rights is mediation, but I also teach that at a local community or a local college. Like the other ones, I do my share of public speaking. My connection to this topic is across the board, but mostly related to civil rights. As we know, quite a bit of conflict can stem within that arena. And so while conflict can be difficult and polarizing, I have seen firsthand that when handled correctly, it can really be a powerful tool for change and progress. And then it can lead us to have some pretty innovative community changes. And so looking forward to listening to my folks on here, and thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And thanks to all of you. You all bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to this. So I'm excited for this conversation. So we are going to start right off with a big question. We are living in times of great polarization and conflict. Yet we know it's important for people to come together and have conversations to bridge divides. You all just spoke about the different industries that you work in. What are you seeing in regard to conflict that is maybe new and different or heightened in your respective industry and in your work? So we're going to start with Angie. Can you give us kind of some perspective from the nonprofit world and the world that you're consulting in?
Yes, absolutely. You're right on that. That is kind of the $1 million question, is what we are seeing and how we individually and collectively manage what we're seeing. One of the opportunities that I think these times kind of provide us is to embrace both, and that when it comes to conflict, I can see your point and I can choose to have a different perspective. That embracing both and allows us to hopefully expand the view of accepting humanity collectively for the diversity of thought, the diversity of backgrounds and experiences that really help us understand that I don't have to base my levels of anxiety and stress on what someone else's opinions are. That I can only control the controllables, and that is my reaction to someone else. And if I truly seek first to understand, then allow myself to be understood, that again expands my awareness and gives me the opportunity to perhaps look at things at a lens that I didn't possess before.
Thank you. That's so true. So much of it begins with us, right? And how we react and respond, actually. So Diane, how about you? You're deep in politics.
My realm of politics, of course, I think we all know that political conversations have become increasingly challenging. And actually for longer than someone might imagine, for several decades. So in my 22 years at the Cat Center, and it might have been because it was more of an academic environment, I had to work. I worked with people across the political spectrum. It was a nonpartisan center. And I felt like even if we disagreed on policy, we were able to discuss it politely and respectfully. I think we shared basic things like a love for democracy, a love for our country. And now what we have is people who don't trust the government. That has been increasingly growing over the years. In the books we've done on the election, we always have a chapter on political polarization. And something that really contributes to that is these media silos that we develop for ourselves, where we only trust one media and then we spread misinformation, like we all saw last week with FEMA, that then gets spread on social media. So going back to when I taught political campaigns at Iowa State University, I would require my students to, in their papers, cite a conservative. I gave them a list of conservative, middle, and liberal sources, and they had to cite one of each in their papers. They had to read each. And so I'm thinking that this approach can be replicated, certainly by community organizations, which I think, we see here in Nebraska, I'm sure you do in Iowa, where you bring people from across the political spectrum, leaders in various industries, and they talk politely and respectfully about maybe a controversial issue. And then I think that way they lead by example. So I think we need more of that in the community. Certainly organizations can do that, but certainly we can do that in the community.
Thank you, Diane. Yes, very, very timely. Al, what's your perspective from the legal side and what you're seeing out in the community and all your community work as well?
Well, thank you so much, Kate. And first of all, it's an honor to be here and share some of my ideas with you. I want to talk about two areas that I've experienced in the last few years. When I first started practicing law, you could shake hands with a lawyer, they would return your call, and there was a lot of what I call congeniality within the profession. As time has passed, I see a lot of the conflict that we have to fight against each other making a turn that everyone may not be uncomfortable with. There's a lot less congeniality within the legal profession. It's becoming more contested. You don't find the sharing of information like things used to be. And I think we need to revisit. I think mediation is starting in the legal profession and is becoming strong, less trial work. I'm not saying that's a good thing because some cases have to be tried and there's more arbitration. This is all good within the legal profession. But I think part of it has to do with how in Iowa, we're kind of politicizing the court. And that's kind of a scary feature of our system where the executive gets involved more with the court system. They're supposed to be three separate branches of government. And I think we expect when we go into the courtroom that we're going to get what who we're best politically connected with. And that's not how the court system should work. I think that increases the conflict to some extent. The other aspect of this I want to talk about with regard to my community work, I think that one of the things we're very embarrassed about in Iowa and in other states to talk about the conflict within Black on Black violence, which has been kind of a pet project of mine. I think we're embarrassed to talk about it, but I think the community, which may be the minority community, wants to be protected from crime, but there's a lack of cooperation. I think the breakdown in communication between law enforcement, the minority community, and young people is causing a greater conflict. How do you get there? I think you sit down, you have to talk about it, you have to communicate, you have to bring these young people to the table with law enforcement officials. I've found out in various communities, it begins to work. But there's been a serious breakdown within the community between law enforcement, the minority community, and the trust. And that has to be rebuilt, but it starts with conversations.
Thank you. Very, very astute observations and on a lot of different levels there. Stephanie, how about you in the civil rights arena? And you're obviously part of dispute resolution education as well. What are you seeing?
Like others have mentioned, we've seen the nature of conflict has really intensified in recent years. I believe it's reflecting broader societal polarization, as others have mentioned. We're seeing heightened tensions around issues of inequities, and it tends to play out in our arena in housing or workplace and schools and public spaces. So those heightened tensions turn in our office into discriminatory complaints. And we've seen a very sharp increase in the number of complaints within our office, over a 60% increase year over year. And it's not just our office. EEOC has seen an increase, HUD has seen an increase. Not only are we seeing more complaints, we're seeing more evidence where discrimination did occur. We are seeing an increase in the complexity of cases. And by that, I mean the number of allegations, from harassment to unfair treatment, to retaliation. And so then we're also seeing, as Al mentioned, less cooperation with respondents, with some attorneys, which makes it challenging because we are a neutral organization here to investigate whether or not discrimination occurred. And it's challenging when we have parties not willing to focus with us. So on the good side, though, while we have more increase in cases, we know discrimination was happening. And so it is good that people are more likely to raise their concerns around the concerns of bias, harassment, or treatment. This has driven in part, increase in our own education or outreach in the community, and our ability to have a sense of justice as much as possible, even across political and cultural divides. We have seen differences and increases in pushback on civil rights and diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, either politically or in organizations. We've seen, kind of the bigger landscape across the nation is kind of here in Iowa as well, where we're seeing people, as Diane mentioned, social media amplification can really amplify conflict very real, very quickly. And so while a conflict that might stay internal between two people exasperates and becomes bigger. And so there can be a public backlash, the rapid spread of information, incorrect or incorrect. And so as others have mentioned, we need to foster that open dialogue and make sure we have those civil rights protections and creating spaces where discrimination can be addressed fairly and swiftly.
That's a great point. And some of our spaces where we're doing that, to your point, are social media. They're not necessarily psychologically safe spaces to be able to navigate these conflicts. So my next question to all of you is, we know as humans, it's really important to navigate conflict, and it's inevitable. Conflict is inevitable, but to navigate it in a healthy way. And we're hearing more and more today about this idea of emotional intelligence. So in that vein, what is good conflict? How would you define it? And how can it be encouraged in the times that we're living in? And Diane, I'm going to let you kick this one off.
Okay. So I come from a communication background. My degrees were in journalism and communication, political communication. So I'm going to come from that. So first, what good conflict needs to me is constructive disagreement. And so it's good to disagree. I mean, it's that disagreement is not bad as long as it's done, I think, in a healthy way. And so it can lead, actually, if you bring in a bunch of people from a variety of backgrounds and encourage a thoughtful discussion, it can create things like new ideas, thinking about things in a different way, problem solving, and then also personal growth for the people engaged in the conversation. So it can be, I think, good conflict can be a healthy way to encourage people to think differently and to enhance our perspectives. So one way I'm going to come from achieving this, and I think probably Angie's going to cover the emotional intelligence, is communication. So one of the things I found in my life in communication is that really what you need to do first, I think, is be a good listener. There's a theory now to listen first. And so I think certainly as a leader of a group or a conversation, you have to listen. You have to focus on ideas and not criticisms. I think we do this by kind of laying the groundwork for the discussion. We have to respect differences in people. And then I think, what I always do, sometimes I think people enter these conversations with wanting to win attitude. And I actually don't enter the thing in wanting to win necessarily. Sometimes you do, but really to enter the conversation with the goal of finding a common ground and finding consensus.
Such a great point. The win and lose paradigm can really not lead us to very many solutions by any means. Al, what's your perspective?
Well, I know when we were doing our preliminary meeting, we talked about John Lewis's mandate of good trouble. And on Sunday, I was at the National Portrait Museum in Washington, D.C., and and they had a great portrait of him. And one of the things they talked about was how you get in good trouble. I think sometimes those of us who disagree with the other person has to find some way to communicate with them in a fashion where they'll sit down and talk. I'll give you an example of what we did in Des Moines to give other communities some ideas. and that is I wanted to focus on gang violence, or what I called black on black violence. I'm sure I was criticized for it, but what we did, we got the police chief, a couple of representatives, some church leaders, other community leaders, like the leader of some of the inner city housing, and let's sit down and we're going to have a meeting and bring some of these young people in to see what they have to say. But you also had the situation where there would be rival gang members also in that same group, to understand, where do we start to solve this problem? We can deal, two things I look at. There's a reckoning with the immediacy of the problem when you see you have 35, 40 homicides in Des Moines over a course of 1 year. Then the other thing you have to look at is long term, like dealing with parenting issues, school issues, pipeline to school. But I think you have to start. I think a lot of people struggle with, where do we start? I go back to the first statement I made. We have to start with a conversation. We have to get people in the room, or even on social media, communicating with each other in a reasonable, rational fashion. But the conversation has to start and not get lost in, well, this is inevitable, we're not going to resolve it. You have to start the conversation. So I think those people who are willing to take risk and bring it to the attention of their colleagues or the other leaders, it will start. And I think everyone has to make a commitment to, let's start the conversation, whether you think you're comfortable with the other person talking about it or whether you're uncomfortable with it. It seems that you make more progress when you get people in a room who are uncomfortable with each other and you start the conversation and you understand the other person's position. So I'm a strong advocate of doing things like that when you have community issues that you need to try to resolve.
Right. So when you don't know how to start, you just start.
You just start, right?
Bring
You
people
look at an
together.
immediate problem and can you at least contribute to a portion of that solution? You're not going to solve it all, but you're going to get it started.
Right. Stephanie, how about you? What is good conflict to you, and how can we encourage it?
As others as mentioned, I see it as, not all conflict is bad. It's, we're humans. We're going to have disagreements, but it's how you engage during those disagreements, the outcome of those disagreements. Are you willing to listen, as Diane said? Are you willing to move forward? Keep pushing forward, as Al said. One of the things that I practice is I try to, and I'm not perfect, of course, but I try to enter all conversations, all engagements with curiosity, rather than assumptions or judgment. Even if I know somebody is polar opposite of the things that I believe in, I don't address that at that time. I'm there just to make that initial authentic relationship. And those relationships are what we need to build upon. And not just transactional relationships where you reach out to somebody when you need something. It's good to reach out to other people on a regular basis. So a few things, as others have mentioned, communication. Even if I disagree with somebody, I can still have a conversation and I can respect what they're saying and I can listen deeply and hear what they're saying. It's just willing to focus on issues. Don't attack the person. Sometimes people tend to take things very personally, and so they lash out at people for their own grievances. So to encourage that, we do need to cultivate that emotional intelligence where we recognize our own emotions, we recognize that of others, we facilitate empathetic interactions, building those skills and establishing clear and healthy communication norms, and giving that safe space for dialogue. I think that's a big part. People are afraid to have a conversation with somebody who is different from them. I hear that quite a bit in my work, and I'm afraid to say the wrong thing. I don't want to hurt their feelings. But and I love how Alice said, you just start. You just have that conversation. So providing that environment in which people feel safe as much as possible, safer and braver, to have those meaningful conversations that can really move that forward.
You're exactly right. That human connectedness, like how do you create a space to connect as humans again? And I think we've moved away from that in so many ways that I think a return to that can be really powerful and maybe exactly what we need is just to spend more time together. Angie, how about you? What would you offer?
One of the benefits within emotional intelligence is that it is becoming more science backed, right? There's research to it. It's not just this warm fuzzy approach or woo woo. It's practical, and research tells us that we achieve better outcomes when we practice and engage and grow within emotional intelligence. One of the things that we are invited to do with emotional intelligence is drop out of our ego. And that feels counterproductive to some types of individuals. That feels puts people in a defensive mindset rather than a strategic or solution focused mindset. One of the things that comes to mind is what Brene Brown has said. We need to enter the conversation with really a gut check. Am I here to be right, which is ego, or am I here to get it right? And when we are too much about being right, that's about us. That's not about the bigger picture or, excuse me, the opportunities that we have to produce a better outcome when we do it together rather than when we do it singly. So I think the opportunity to first learn more about what emotional intelligence is based on science, based on what mainstream practicality tells us, and utilize some of those skill building opportunities to get better at practicing emotional intelligence.
Yeah. And at least in some of my work, that emotional intelligence for leaders and in institutions is what is going to shift. Having that people model that is really, really going to be kind of, I think that's our next wave of leadership, quite honestly. So I want to get to kind of our cultural piece to this. So civil conversations can be the starting point to understanding perspective across cultures. How can hard conversations or necessary conversations in an organization actually help the culture and create connection? So Al, let's start with you on this one. How does this help culturally connect us?
Okay. Can you explain that a little bit better for me?
Yeah. So,
Okay.
so having, we have a lot of, disagreements between cultures
Right.
now. And
Right.
so, and you kind of spoke to this already a little bit with just starting and sitting down with each other, but how do you encourage people to come to that hard conversations? How do you bring people to the table? And how have you seen some connections happen when you do that helps people understand and kind of bridge that divide between cultures?
Well, interesting you bring that up because yesterday I was my first meeting was in Black Hawk County, and I was sharing with the people in the room why I loved Iowa so much. And Iowans, even though it's changed since I first came here in 1967, and I won't talk about the politics of the change when Harold Hughes and all these great folks were here, but it has changed. But the other night I was in a room with former Governor Branstad, and I was telling him how great he was in selecting our judges. It was that Lou Lavarado's the Chief Justice of Supreme Court 90th birthday that I was lucky enough to be invited to. And I was telling him, he said, Al, I never put politics as part of my decision to pick the best judge. Iowa starts with a really great base. For about 6 years, I did nothing but farmers work during the 80s when I was trying to save a lot of Iowa's farms. I sued a lot of banks, defended a lot of farmers, got a chance to know Iowa really well, I think. I tried cases in 66 of its 99 counties in my career. Iowans are some of the best people on the planet. And I was sharing that with someone yesterday. So we start with a good base. The question is, how do we make that next step in dealing with cultures? I think a lot of times there's some fear that people feel, when they meet, say, a young African American who might have initial conflict with the law. And they say, well, do I bring you into the fold? Do I talk to you? Do I try to understand your problems? Or we might meet, and now we're having a big growth in the Hispanic population in this state. Does this language barrier stop us from communicating? And a third of our clients are Spanish-speaking folks. But all go back to a real simple and basic theme. Iowa has traditionally been a great state for welcoming. You saw what Governor Ray did, when the Tadam came in. You see what we do with employment issues. You see that we were on the front of the Civil Rights Commission. I wrote an article a few years ago in Drake Law Review talking about this great, rich tradition, how Iowa 70 years before we had Brown versus Board of Education, we had a case out of Muscatine where the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. If we in Iowa, and I want to keep it specific to here, rely on our rich history that we have with diversity, with embracing it, with making the world better, with being leaders in this type of issue, if we start there, we'll open the door to these cultural divides that we seem to be generating. And I know I'm a little bit biased, but I think a lot of that's coming from out of state. Iowans didn't create that. So I'm just saying that I think if we look at our rich history and what we have done in this state, we've been more in terms of embracing diversity than rejecting it. So I would say start with our history. That would give us a good view for where we ought to be and where we ought to go.
Such a good point. Sometimes we have to look back before we can move forward, right?
Right.
Stephanie, you obviously must see this a lot in your work. How are you helping organizations bridge that cultural divide?
I go back to human connection and recognizing the humanity of other people, be it even if they're different than you, especially if they're different than you. Everybody has a desire to connect with other humans. That's how we're hardwired. That's how we survive. We want to feel like we belong, where everybody has a voice and co-create and have the power to co-create. One of the biggest things around that is learning from one another, be willing to listen to other people. There's so much, the older I get, the more I realize how little I know. I have an 18-year-old and a 30-year-old, and I turned 50 this year, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't think I know anything. And so you have to constantly be curious and willing to, like someone before said, check your ego a little bit. A quote I came across years ago is, do you want to be right or do you want to be in a relationship? And at the end of the day, what is more important? And I love that quote you said, Angie, about do you want to be right or do you want to get it right? So we need to work on focusing on breaking down those barriers, finding those hard conversations are crucial. Those can be done in a very healthy way in which we're, again, not attacking the other person. We're talking about, this is the issue. This is where we are. We might not agree, but what can we do to find common ground to move things forward? And that's what we do in mediation. It's like, what is the lowest common denominator sometimes? What is, okay, sometimes it's like, you're both willing to participate. You're both willing to be in the same room, and we'll take that. And so we have to grow from there. We also encourage perspective taking. I live my life. I know what I have lived, but I don't know what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. And so engaging those hard conversations allows us to step outside of our own experiences and to consider the perspective of other people and assist in building those relationships and being sure that we do value those diverse voices, that we do listen. They have expertise in their own lived experiences, and we need to listen to that. I also like to say, just because it hasn't happened to me doesn't mean it hasn't happened to you. Sometimes people have a little hard time understanding if you live your life in a certain experience, other people have different experiences that might happen. They might have discriminatory actions happen, and not everybody lives like that. And so recognizing that, and it, again, common denominator comes down to human connection and truly recognizing and loving. And if you can't love, respect, be kind to people who have a different background and respecting their humanity.
I was just going to say, seeing that humanity, right,
Yes,
in someone
yes.
else at the most basic
Right.
level.
Even if you don't agree with them.
Right. That's right. That's right. But seeing the humanness, connecting on that human level.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephanie. Angie, what are your thoughts?
Another take on that is one of the evidence-based leadership practices that are the framework of what I do within both the nonprofit and higher ed space, and that's challenge the process. And what is essential about that practice is that it's challenge the process, not challenge the person. And as we know, there are some individuals who take pride in their ability to challenge people. And it's more, again, about their ego of wanting to be viewed as a challenger, or, as the proponent of a different perspective, because it's about their own personal agenda. If we back up and zoom out a little bit and take a look at the entire process, whether that's a system or a culture or a bigger picture, then it helps us reevaluate, is what I'm challenging really worth the challenge? Am I willing to risk relationships? Am I willing to risk my values? Am I willing to put at risk some of the things that I hold near and dear simply because I want to be viewed as a challenger? Or is it truly that I see a better outcome that can be done with a group of people, not to a group of people, in order of challenging the process versus the person?
That's a great perspective. And I think we see that a lot in different industries, working together as well. So Diane, how about you?
Well, I'm just going to add a little bit more to what's already been said. So there's actually been a lot of research on this in organizational leadership and also in politics. And so one of the things is, without conflict, you really get into something that people call groupthink. And so they're all the same and they all think the same. And then we really don't have we don't have innovation. We don't spark creativity because everybody's thinking the same. So instead, what research shows, and there was a lot of groundbreaking research in the area of corporations, when they were putting their boards of directors together from the outside, and when they were all white men, they weren't having that diversity of experiences and opinions. And so this also enters into the realm of politics, and some of the research I do that argues that electing more women, electing more minorities, electing more engineers, some scientists to our political organizations, helps with that diversity of outcomes and experiences, and really leads to innovative solutions. It leads to actually more collaboration. That's what research shows, more collaboration and working through a goal. So that's what I think. Again, we don't want to get into groupthink. We want to bring in a diversity in any organization we have. We want to embrace that diversity, hear that diversity, increase that diversity, because it does, in the corporate world, it actually leads to making more money for the corporation.
Right. Yeah. Good for the bottom line, good
Yeah.
for innovation, good for community relations, good for all of it. All right, we're going to move into this idea of how this connects to leadership. So what responsibility do leaders have to courageously lead by example when it comes to fostering more civil, open, and honest communication? And Stephanie, we're going to start with you. What responsibility do leaders have in this space?
Leaders are pivotal in fostering a culture of open and honest communications within organizations. I can't emphasize enough how important that is. We need to embody and model the behavior. If somebody's going to come talk to me, I need to listen as a leader, and I need to encourage people to feel, we hear the term psychologically safe, and absolutely, I need to make sure people feel safe in talking to me. I need to embody those principles and create that safe environment in which people feel safe to express their thoughts, their opinions, without fear of retaliation or judgments. Sometimes it comes down, depending on where the organization is, sometimes it might come down to defining what safe or good communication really is. Sometimes people just don't know, like they said before. Sometimes people are just excited to challenge the person, not the process. But let's define that. Let's just bring that straight up forward, and to address those conflicts as constructively as possible, understanding emotions, understanding humans. And of course, as a leader, it's important to provide the resources. People don't know what they don't know. And so we need to make sure that we give them the information that helps them. And then, of course, I need to hold myself accountable as a leader, hold the folks that I work with accountable, and just make sure that they have the resources to encourage for overall organizational effectiveness by fostering open and clear communication.
Right. It's really setting the culture of the organization. That's the leader's role.
Yes.
And so making that, having these conversations be part of that culture. Angie, you do a lot of work with leaders. What are your thoughts on the leadership role?
Yeah, again, going back to my work as a certified master for the leadership challenge, the very first practice within that model is called model the way. It is leading by example. I think this is another opportunity for us to practice both and. We can be Iowa nice and engage in productive, difficult conversations. Many times leaders will shy away from having to have those crucial engagements, whether it's an employee or whether it's, advocacy work or whatever might come onto their plate that they would rather ignore and hope it goes away, versus addressing it and being able to solve a problem versus allowing it to get worse. So I think truly allowing ourselves to be an example in productively addressing conflict, not choosing to create conflict, but not stepping away from it and assuming that it's going to get better on its own. Again, it's truly embedding model the way as one of our personal practices as well as a leadership practice.
Yes. And I always go back to that idea of developing people, right? When we're trying to develop people as a leader, modeling the way is so critical to that. They are watching and learning from you.
Right.
Diane, how about you in the realm of politics and your work?
So in the realm of education, which also involves some politics, in directing leadership programs at Iowa State, not only for students, but also for faculty and staff, I found it helpful to use a personality assessment tool. At Iowa State, we use both the MBTI or the Myers-Briggs type indicator. But for students, we typically use Strength Finder, which I've just learned has been now rebranded as Clifton Strengths. And that was sort of a helpful thing. So what it helps with, and there's other assessment tools on the market. I think Angie mentioned one the other day when we were getting ready for this. But the whole purpose of them is to help people in a group identify their strengths or their personality types, and then to gain some understanding of others and how they take in information and make decisions. So in addition to the leadership studies program at Iowa State, I led the what was known as shared leadership for institutional change. So the shared in there will tell you kind of about our goals. We use the MBTI. I think that was the first time I took it. And what it helped me is to figure out how I worked as a day-to-day administrator and professor. I was able to understand different personality types, my personality type, how what I did affected them. And then how they, affected their communication styles, their self-awareness, and then what I needed to do, importantly, what I needed to do to adjust my leadership style.
Yeah, that self-awareness piece is so critical. And we need more of that, I would say, across the board. Al, what are your thoughts on leadership and how this plays into leaders' role, frankly?
Well, let me remind everyone at this conference about a couple of things. Remember when Iowa used to have the highest, close to the highest ACT test and the SAT test? We only competed with Wisconsin. Remember when Iowa Law School used to be ranked in the top 10 in the country because we had the second best library next to Harvard? Remember when our school kids had the best test scores around, and we used to be the envy of the United States? And our court system was one of the most quoted opinion writers in the United States at one point. Well, what happened here in Iowa? I think it's perhaps a failure of leadership. I mean, we can blame the pandemic for part of it, but somehow we've lost our direction in terms of getting our leaders together. The Gazette obviously was a leader in Eastern Iowa, the Register in Central Iowa, and I know print media has had its issues, but there has been I think, a lack of good leadership in Iowa, and I think that perhaps. And then look at our schools now. Private schools are thriving, the public schools are dying, and we sit around. And I've written a letter, I haven't sent it out yet, to the Register criticizing what's happening here. No one is complaining. We don't have the good conflict. We don't have the good trouble. And we watch our leaders here kind of succumb to this, what we started our conversations with, and that was politics have been so divided that people forget when they're elected, as leaders, they have to reach out to the whole state, not just to the people who elected them. And we're failing. Iowa is known for its ability to get along and be a leader. And in all those areas that I just mentioned, we're losing our ability to. Now, I'm going to end on a positive note. We can get these leaders together again. Iowa can recapture its, what I call its rich tradition that I've talked about already, and be a leader, but they have to do it incrementally. You're not going to hit a home run. I like to use athletic anecdotes. We're not going to hit a home run the first time, but we can hit a single, we can bunt, we can get on base, we can hit a double, a triple, like my team did last night, and unfortunately beat Kansas City. But, we won't talk about that. What I want to talk about is whether or not Iowa leaders can start with Iowa State President, Iowa's president, the governor's office, the Board of Regents, where she's just appointed a couple of really decent people. A woman who's a friend of mine just got appointed there, Christine Hensley, and get us back on track. But leaderships have to talk. They have to forget about politics. Politics does not control the world. Ideas control the world. And that's what we need to do again. And unfortunately, we have lost that leadership. So I want to end on a positive note. I think it can be found again, but there has been a consistent failure of leadership within this state that is really sad to see.
Yeah, but to your point, you're an optimist. It's not too late. There's opportunity. So we had a viewer question that kind of fits into this next question. I want to ask you what tools and strategies you might recommend when it comes to bringing people together that have various positions on an issue, and how we can engage them in constructive and respectful ways. And one of the viewers asked, what role do you see for neutral third-party mediators to assist in resolving difficult conflicts? And how do you go about identifying the right mediator for that? So as that is a potential tool, any of you that might have insight on that would be great. But Angie, can you start with some tools and strategies that you think are helpful?
Yes, absolutely. Diane and I had shared some of the tools that we have used in the past. And I am a DISC practitioner, which is a behavioral assessment from an organizational perspective. And it removes the person in that it focuses on the behavior, which I think allows us to bring that neutrality when engaging in conversations. Because once I have the willingness, which I think it is required to do in order to get what Al brought up, how do we teach those skills? First of all, the leaders have to be willing to learn about themselves, which means going into some scary, dark, ugly truths about how we got to where we are. And that makes us vulnerable. That makes us dive into emotional intelligence. But unless we're willing to learn more about ourselves, we're not going to be able to extend that neutrality and be able to engage in healthy, productive, good conflict. So DISC is a tool that I use. I also reevaluate my values as well as the values of the individuals I'm working with, and then compare that within an organizational setting to their values. Two people can hold the exact same value, and behaviorally, it can be demonstrated very differently. So by attacking another person's values, I'm making an assumption that I know what their values are, when simply I'm focusing on their behavior, which may not be consistent with my demonstration of a value. So I think values and behaviors, whichever method one utilizes to get there, are two essential tools that can be added to make this space even more productive.
And that really knowing yourself and knowing others that you're working with on a daily basis. Diane, you've already mentioned Strengths Finders. Talk more about that or any other tools that you think are critical in this space.
Oh,
Looks like she's muted.
Oh, she got muted. I don't think I can unmute you. All right, we're gonna fix that.
Okay.
Pam will fix that, and then we're gonna move on to Al.
Yeah, well, I think it's a good point. In our profession, I'll just use it just for my last week. I was down in Davenport, and we used a neutral. It was a former Judge Jarvie, and I've used several other judges, Lou Lavarado, other people. it's probably the future of our profession to some extent. Unfortunately, we're losing trial lawyers because the younger lawyers don't know how to go into court, try cases, and they look to do all the discovery and they go in and mediate. What I look for, and I really think neutrals are good. And there's this old saying, two old sayings I'll share with you. The first one is that when two people walk out of a conference with a neutral and they're both disappointed, that means it's been a successful mediation or arbitration. Yeah. The other one is nothing happens good before 4 o'clock if you start your mediation at 8 o'clock in the morning. So it's not until 4 o'clock when you sit down and write that agreement out do you feel like you've reached it. In the long run, it's less expensive. You get the parties together, they shake hands, they sign a mutual agreement. I think it's a great tool to be used. My only caution is that it should not be overused because we need young lawyers to be able to litigate, to go to court, to do appeals. So, but in other areas, and I think people underuse it, I think it can be used in like conflicts within the community, such as police in the community. I think it can be used at schools where there's a high, where they kick out students at a higher rate. You can bring the parents, the teachers, the principals in and do that. So it's underutilized in other areas. But I've found it to be one of the best tools, and I've been practicing law a long time. It's one of the best tools I've ever seen introduced. And I like to see people use it in other areas a lot more because it works. It's almost a miracle, a solution to a lot of our issues.
As a mediator, I could not agree more. And I would love to see it taught at younger ages. I think it's a skill set for life, actually, to be able to understand how to mediate. Diane, you're good now. How about some tools and strategies?
So I apologize. I'm still having seasonal allergies and I was going to cough, so I muted myself and then I couldn't get back in. So anyway, so the question we're answering is strategies or tools or
yeah.
We'll talk a little bit about how I go about having conversations with people. Now that I've retired from Iowa State University and I live in Nebraska, but not in the blue dot, somewhat south of that, and in more of a rural area. And so when people ask what I did at Iowa State, I would say I worked at Iowa State. If I said I directed the Center for Women in Politics, then they always want to talk to me about politics. And so I try to be careful about it. So again, as I kind of mentioned earlier, I don't really start out a conversation like that to have a winning attitude like, well, here's my position, I'm going to convince you to it. Instead, I kind of try to talk to them, find some common ground, kind of see what our consensus is. And then I think one of the things I've already mentioned this too is I really try to listen. But I think the other thing is I really find it useful to ask questions. And these can be a variety of questions. These can be open-ended questions that kind of encourage people to be more specific about what they're saying. These can be clarifying questions like, well, what did you mean by that? Or can you tell me a little bit more about it? Or it can be kind of a follow-up question, especially in a group setting that encourages other people to ask questions. And so again, my two big things or get three, I guess, is, try to first establish a common ground. It's not about winning, it's about consensus or a common ground, because you're not going to convince everybody to come to your point of view. And so then I think the first thing too is really listening, develop really active listening skills, and then asking constructive questions.
That's great. Totally agree. Diane or Stephanie, what are your thoughts on some tools that you use in your role in the Civil Rights Office?
Certainly, we like others, we use mediation and conciliation quite a bit, as much as possible. It gives power to the parties to define the solution. And I love, Al, we say the same thing of not everybody, if somebody's a little bit disappointed, then we've done our job. Because we are a neutral organization. So that made me chuckle. I think one piece also starts with self-regulation. Instead of viscerally reacting to something, how can I manage my own emotional responses? Many years ago, one of my first performance review, my boss said, Stephanie, you wear your heart on your sleeve. And I was like, oh yeah, I do. And so I learned a lot from that. I still have a big passionate heart, but I've learned to regulate my own responses. So I take deep breaths, or I take a pause before responding. I have a sticky note that says, slow down. because I need that visible reminder. We need to equip people to know how to do those kind of things. And to Diane's point in regards to focusing on the interests, instead of focusing on the positions that we're in, what are the interests? What are the underlying things that we both need to resolve? And how do we satisfy those as much as possible? And then, of course, encouraging that, that culture of feedback from a leader. As a leader, we need to ask for, and sometimes we have to, like in 101, say, hey, can you please tell me what it is you need from me, or provide other mechanisms for your coworkers to respond or give you feedback, and then listen to it. Don't just file it away and say, okay, great, thanks a lot, moving on. Take it to heart. And what are some ways in which you can implement some of that? So making sure, again, it goes back to the connection and deep listening. What is that saying? We listen, people like to listen to respond, rather listen to hear. And so I have been guilty of that. When somebody's speaking, I'm like, okay, this is what I'm going to say next. Instead, I should be inherently just listening and connecting with that person, being curious about their point of view, instead of thinking what I'm going to say next. And so I think, removing your ego and some self-regulation and some connections and listening, a lot of really amazing things have happened. And I've seen that through restorative justice circles or mediations, really powerful solutions arise.
Thank you for bringing up the emotional regulation. I think that's speaking my language. That is something we need to tap into more and learn tools around, because you can't have conversations from a high level of emotion that are going to be productive.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to surprise our panelists with something. I have two more questions for you, and we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to ask like a rapid fire. I just want a phrase or even one word to this question. What potential, especially in Iowa, do you see in having good conflict for our communities and our state? I'll start with you, Diane.
Well, I would say what we could have is just better communication and understanding of different points of view, and the ability to talk to each other. 45% of us now don't want to talk about politics with someone.
Yeah. Al, how about you? What's your phrase? Or
I would say, look at Iowa's rich history and pick up that history and start talking with each other again.
That's great. Stephanie?
I would say strengthening our relationships and our resilience and adaptability.
And Angie?
Self-awareness, meaning lead yourself first. So essentially be an example and model the way.
All right, I'm going to give you our final question. This has been such a rich discussion. I first just want to thank all of you. Really, you have so much insight, and it's so interesting how this thread of good conflict really does touch every industry and every organization and our lives at home and at work. So it's such a powerful topic. You brought this up a little bit earlier, Al, but we did talk as a group before when we prepared that the late U.S. Congressman John Lewis is famous for saying, "Get in good trouble," when talking about the lessons of the civil rights movement. In today's challenging times, is it possible to stir up good trouble? And what does that phrase mean to you? And we're going to let Al answer first.
I think it is a good thing to get into good trouble. When I reached out in our local community and also in Waterloo about the issue of Black on Black violence, it was embarrassing. I wrote about it. I talked about it. I was criticized for it, but it's a problem. Iowa is so unique because we can solve a problem like that with all of our brilliant people around us. And so, yes, I would advise people, get in good trouble, have those embarrassing and difficult conversations with your friends, neighbors, and leaders.
Thank you. Angie, how about you? Real quick.
I would say be a respectful disruptor.
Love that. Diane, how about you?
I'll be quick, become more informed, get out of your media bubble and read a variety of news sources. Don't spread misinformation that you see online. Vote in every election. Only 66% of us voted in 2020, and that was an all-time high. And finally, what I've learned, you're never too young or too old to make a difference. So get involved and make a difference.
Good trouble. And Stephanie, bring us home.
Absolutely. Good trouble is not only possible, but it's essential for us to move forward as a healthy community. I would just say his legacy inspires us to take those risks and embrace our roles as change makers. In doing so, we embrace and continue to fight for justice for everybody.
That is such a great note to leave us on. Thank you again, all of you, for everything you brought to the discussion today, and for all the great work you're doing in our state, in your communities, in the world. There's a ripple to this, and I hope we've inspired people today to look at their own opportunities to get in good trouble, to have these powerful, difficult, but good potential conversations. So thanks again to everyone for joining us, and we'll sign off at this time. Thank you.
Been
Thank you.
enjoyable.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Such a
everybody.
pleasure.
Mhm. Bye-bye.
Bye.